So Judith Ricketts is an exhibiting artist, early career researcher, a lecturer and module leader across 3 courses, which are design for digital media, game arts and animation. And she's also a visiting lecturer in graphic design at the University of Brighton. So I'll hand over to Judith.
My practice is thematically centered on the spatial memory of the city's built environment as an intersectional backdrop to examine the data related to the gaze. That is human to human looking, and by extension, machines that see, under the guise of technological neutrality. This neutrality, however, we know, inhabits very specific positioning, which can lead to issues related to the blurring of boundaries between individual privacy, law enforcement, and private commercial enterprise. Questions raised in my practice relate to ways in which human to computer interaction can be employed as a strategic tool to engage audiences with difficult subjects in the field of serious games. Serious games, for me, is about unremembered stories. Some of the media I use in this work are the photograph, moving image, facial detection, motion detection, augmented reality, virtual reality, and conversational design for chatbots. The technology is so varied because I choose the technology based on the nature of the question that is being asked in the research. Very much the philosophy that form ever follows function. So the question is lead here and not the technology. So today I'm going to talk about Matterbot, which is a work in progress, a chatbot which uses motion graphics, audio, the photograph, data, which is delivered in browser over mobile. Instructions for use. Select an answer, have a chat, and take action. Matterbot is a curated selection of social media and research data. It is a bespoke interactive work in the chatbot aesthetic designed to create real-world conversation and action for positive social change. It seeks to contextualize the preceding centuries which led to the death of George Floyd on Monday, the 25th of May, 2020, following which it touches on the subsequent resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement and then culminates in a call to action for the user presented in the form of subject-related hashtags. The project was originally created as a snapshot of a moment with content to mirror that limitation, framed in terms of how could I best tell a story of what I just witnessed within a framework of 31 days. However, the death of George Floyd was not like any other death in police custody. It was filmed and it was witnessed, and it moved from network to network in all its graphic reality. Everyone who witnessed the film became the digital eyewitnesses to a murder. A man died in front of us like it was nothing. This was a tipping point for many, which saw a public outpouring of urgent protest, comment, and demands for action. 2 things happened to necessitate the extension of the research phase. Firstly, racial trauma revisited, caused by manually engaging with research containing racially motivated acts of violence to then operate, evaluate procedures and formulate cohesive narratives on an hourly basis for an extended period of time was both physically and emotionally exhausting. It was draining, and by September 2020, this needed to be accounted for in the project timeline. Secondly, the nature of public action and protest had subsequently developed into individual introspection, which then broadened into corporate and institutional confession. This in turn meant that those in the Black community and those who were listening could hear more acutely the comparative deafening silences of no response. So 31 days as a way to reconcile the project timeline with the funding structure, in order to draw a line in the sand for the research phase, in order to draw a line in the sand to begin the narrative production process, in order to write the technical specification, was a pace driven by the fund, which needed to be allocated by the end of July 2020. But events were still unfolding and changing, and 31 days was no longer enough. There are four main areas to this experience. There is the idea of subverting the conversational system from its usual contemporary use by global commercial brands using the chatbot for commercial digital marketing to sell products, towards a more democratic use of the chatbot for the dissemination of information to empower individuals and to promote positive social change for well-being, such as the AI chatbot Rainbow, that is trying to turn the tide of sexual violence against women in South Africa, or the Walk with Yeshi chatbot, a narrative bot designed to humanize the global water crisis from the perspective of an Ethiopian. Matterbot sits in that aesthetic, a narrative tool designed to pose difficult questions and scenarios which have been asked many times before. Again, this will not be the first time those questions and scenarios fill the ears with sound, but maybe it's perhaps the first time it will be heard. So these are questions about questions which up until May 2020, very few people, organizations, and institutions were prepared to hear, see, or to answer. Then there is the content and the research, the under the surface part of the iceberg. It requires a greater weighting in the project timeline, partly because it sits in the academy tradition of peer review, and so therefore social media data, although it might be very interesting, if found to be fake news or unverifiable in some way, could not be used in this context. In addition, there's also the potential for this data set to become its own discrete archive. So that was our approach in generating this information. This is followed by the user interface and narrative experience. When designing our own interface, we asked ourselves, how are we going to set the stage? What was the chatbot's persona? Who or what was speaking? Matterbot had been the working title from the beginning, and so in asking these questions, it was a natural decision that Matterbot was an extension of my own practice, and so therefore it was me speaking. So from that point onwards, it was very easy for Matterbot's voice to become my own, and embedded in that was a decision to ask the user their own name, to embed that experience in the bot as well. In designing user behaviors, there was an acknowledgement that the subject matter is harmful in any environment, let alone a chatbot space. So it was decided to break up the conversation with mixed media. So Matterbot became more three-dimensional in its composition, foreground and background layers. Also, the narrative experience with which the user had the opportunity to interact became this multi-sensory experience with a conversation that was ebbing and flowing, and we tried to make the conversation more credible. And finally, there is a call to action. Embedded in Matterbot, a fundamental purpose is the idea of creating real-world conversation and real-world action. It uses hashtags as thematic headings, which in themselves are part of the opportunity for participants to follow up and to take action after the conversation. The next stages are to complete the conversation design, carry out testing and the feedback loop, and complete the documentation and to archive the data. So Matterbot is a comment on the contemporary times. This conversation is part of the introduction to the motivation of the research and is part narrated journey and comment on my own voice within the practice and the research. And finally, an opportunity to have a conversation during the process of its making. Thank you for listening.